Yet again, October is around, and that means the best holiday is here, Halloween. So, what not a better way to celebrate and to talk about horror tabletop role-playing games? And while this topic has been treaded several times by other really awesome tabletop RPG YouTubers and content creators, I wanted to do a different take. Specifically, I wanted to investigate the question of how not to make a horror tabletop role-playing game. So, here are my personal suggestions on what not to do for your next horror RPG session. Never assume the game you're playing is inherently a horror RPG. Plus, you should know the difference between a horror-themed game and a horror game. Horror-themed RPGs are games that may use horror tropes or themes on a game or in a game that wasn't intended explicitly for horror tabletop role-playing. For instance, Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition's famous Curse of Strahd or Tomb of Horror scenarios are those examples. Now, are they themed with horror elements? Yes, totally. I mean, Tomb of Horrors has horrors in its name, and Curse of Strahd is a well-regarded campaign setting with loads of creepy monsters, awful traps, and the big bad old vampire himself, Strahd. But these games, unless the GM puts in a large amount of homebrew and work, I would not classify as horror RPGs. But if you disagree, let me know down below in the comment section. However, I haven't defined a horror RPG, so to cite someone way more knowledgeable on this topic, here's Ash Law, an author and game designer for 13th Age, who has spoken about how to do effective horror in her essay, The Trajectory of Fear. She states that horror can come to 5 stages for TTRPGs. First, it's the general normalcy of the situation. It's the lives characters live before the horror begins. Second is unease. It's knowing something isn't right or it's just spooky. 3 is dread. Knowing something isn't right and it's here, aka thriller or unease, plus the presence. 4th, terror. Knowing something isn't right and it's here and it's about to strike, but hasn't yet. And finally, horror. The monster is here and now and is attacking. In summary then, I would define horror as a mood. Horror is the thought that I have no idea what is going on and your character is unequipped to handle it. It's the rush of discomfort we feel at the combo of unease, dread, terror, and of course, horror. It is for that reason a game like Call of Cthulhu is a horror game. Its setting and mechanics focus on battling the horrors of the mythos and all of the dread, unease, terror, and certainly sanity-reducing horrors that come with it. Whereas Curse of Strahd's 5e can feel horror-themed, but does not feel like horror because the characters even at level 1 are way more empowered and capable than most mundane characters outside of 5e are. Funnily enough, this leads us into our next point. Don't use an empowering setting to tell your horror tabletop game session. I would say 5e is an empowering setting, but what do I mean by empowering? These are games with superhero-like mechanics or pulp mechanics. In these games, the player characters have loads of mechanics that can trivialize the horror of the situation. This would include games with power scaling and HP bloat like 5e or Savage Worlds. These are games where there are mechanical ways for players to circumvent or to destroy the horrors that surround them. So how do you capture this feeling of horror when you're playing powerful and pulpy characters in a game that's meant for high zany action? So games like 5e or Savage Worlds will require heavy lifting on behalf of the GM, or as we discussed in our previous point, it's going to require you to play a horror-themed game. Also, don't stop your players from having fun and being funny in your horror RPG. Give players and the player characters downtime and time to make jokes. This will allow players to recuperate and relax rather than being stressed by every single horrifying encounter. Humor is a great way both in character and out of character to respond to tense and awful situations. Think about it. How many times have you been in really uncomfortable situations and a quick joke got you out of that situation? So, let those jokes, if a player does say something like that, happen. Plus, Who wouldn't laugh at the horrors of the world when everything around you is falling apart and the horrors beyond your comprehension are tearing your mind piece by piece? Not telegraphing danger is another key component. It's not fun when danger comes from nowhere in your tabletop role-playing game. In fact, without build-up, the execution of a horrifying situation will feel tacky and weak. And plus, player character death does not inherently mean it's scary. How can a dead character be afraid? And subsequently, how is a player supposed to enjoy the dread and tension of a situation if they don't have a character to play with? Furthermore, how can players respond accordingly to said danger if the GM does not give hints and or clues on responding to the danger? In order to create a tense situation, you need to telegraph danger and even sometimes explain risks. By doing this, I think the players can make informed decisions as the GM escalates the situation every moment. Also, don't expect characters to walk into danger without motivation and reason. No character with any reasonable sense of mind is going to run into a haunted mansion or a burning building for no reason. Characters need motivation and reasons to do things that they otherwise wouldn't want to do. If your normal everyday life consists of you working your average 9 to 5, it makes no sense for your character to go out of their way to go to a haunted house that they know is clearly dangerous and sketchy. So, why is your character investigating this totally haunted mansion as an example? Is it to save a loved one? Is it because they need the money that comes from this request? Is it because of a dare from their college buddies? Is it from their lost wife or husband who they now hear of in their dreams? The motivation needs to be there, and that motivation should be crafted with the other players. The motivation should be core to that character's beliefs, tenets, or wants. Why? Because by tying it to the character's wants, you can expect for the character to go into danger, and when things inevitably start failing and get terrifying, your character can pull from that motivation for both good and bad roleplay reasons. Good and bad meaning moments where they can really shine and they're awesome, and also moments where the character is at their deepest, darkest point. As for GMs, don't try to force your players into dangerous encounters. It will feel tacky, and the players will feel railroaded, especially if they're not wanting to do that. That's why it's important to telegraph danger and build reasons why the characters investigate the horrors that lurk below. To top this all off, you need to make sure that your characters aren't disposable either. And a disposable character or NPC is one that adds no value to the game. For instance, random NPCs dying in the background don't matter to the characters. Subsequently, a character that has no motivation, no backstory, and is just fodder for the enemy or for the villain is not a character I will feel anything for if they die. For instance, killing off a random NPC for no reason is not scary, but hinting at the death of an NPC from a mysterious creature the PC have heard of can be scary. You notice how one of the examples is personal while the other one is super obtuse and quite frankly not relevant to the story? Because what is horrifying about characters who are not important? If the players and GM are not invested in the character or NPC, then their death doesn't add to the mood of the table. The player has to want the character to survive, and the character has to want to survive themselves. After all, we only fear to lose the things we care about. So it's important to think as a player, what is something your character fears to lose? Work that into the motivation and character's backstory, so that when drama and tension builds, the GM can pull from that to ratchet up the horror of the game. Finally, last but not least, safety tools are paramount to a fun and enjoyable horror RPG. You have to set boundaries in these games because there's a wide range of topics that can happen in a horror RPG. Some that I'm not going to mention on YouTube, but let's just say it can be pretty problematic if you don't properly handle these issues and address them. I recommend in Session 0 then to discuss what content will occur in the game as well as what content will not be included. Take serious time to think as an individual and for your group what is not going to appear in your game. Is it going to be gendered slurs, or is it going to be something like slavery or say harm to children? It's important to consider all these topics and more. You can do this by looking at a list of topics and presenting each of them to the players during your session 0. It could be in a cool form, or you could just discuss this openly amongst your friends and peers. Horror is not an easy mood to set. It sometimes is going to be awkward setting a scene and players rip a dumb joke or fart joke. Trust me, I've been there. Or you're playing in a game and your GM brings up a topic you didn't want to hear and you didn't discuss in session 0. Horror RPGs can be frustrating and they can go all sorts of ways. But it does not mean they aren't impossible. And it takes working together with everyone at the table to battle the worst horror of them all. A crappy time at your tabletop role-playing game table. Of course, you might be looking for something of a little bit more meat and potatoes to sink your fangs into. Well, I have a perfect video for you. Check out this video to learn more on how to build horror and fear in your next TTRPG. And as always, I'm your average everyday queer host, Blurry Disposition. Be all, have an awesome day. Ciao. And if you want to support my content, feel free to check out my Patreon, Coffee, or like and subscribe so you can see more awesome and future content.